What I want to do now is to pick up where we left off last time with Coronado coming in. I left you with the point that the Coronado came onto the Great Plains, and he may well have been, the first example that we have of an outsider coming onto the plains and totally misunderstanding what he was seeing. Seeing it as a sort of place without any possibilities, a place without any real history, whereas in fact he was coming into a place that was a land of convergence and of confluence, of complicated interactions and exchanges with across the entire continent. That he may well have been invited into that, and yet somehow missed the point. In any case, what we do know for certain is that unintentionally, what Coronado did was to set off a true revolution on the Great Plains. I call it the grass revolution. And I use the term revolution literally. Revolution has many different definitions. But a revolution in the sense of a change sort of down to the root of things. In this case, quite literally. A fundamental tidal shift in the ways of life and in the history of the Great Plains, set loose by this first touch of outside contact in the person of Coronado. What's also interesting in terms of this revolution is that it ended up coinciding with the other American Revolution, let's call it. The American Revolution that we associate with leaders like this and that we associate with battles like this, with documents like this. This revolution sort of came together, came into focus at the same time as this one. The one that we usually think of as the American Revolution. And yet this revolution had leaders like this and that. Battles like that. Documents like that. And yet it'll be argued to you that this revolution in its way was as rich in its meanings and lessons, was as important for its people, and in the long run, in the larger scheme of things, I think is as revealing to American history as that other one. And this revolution had to do above all with this, grass, which, as I said in the first lecture, is sort of the basis of all life on the Great Plains. Everything else literally rests upon it. Go back to this. Remember this trading network that was in place about the time of the coming of Europeans. This remarkable system. This is a simplified version of it. It was more complex than this. A system of permanent trading systems, centers, a system of annual and semi-annual gatherings, trade fairs they call them, a system in which goods were exchanged all the way across the continent. One anthropologist has suggested that in any large population of native peoples, any large group of peoples, there were probably a couple of people at least, these professional traders, who at some time in their lives had seen both oceans, had moved all the way across the continent. So this was a vibrant period of movement at the time of the coming of Europeans. And what happens when Europeans show up and touch this system is that they are immediately drawn into it, purposely or not. This slide is a reproduction of trading systems after the coming of Europeans. This is the way goods moved once Europeans really began to become involved in the life and trade of North America. Now look at these two slides together. What I'll do is toggle back and forth here between the two and look at them together. It's the same thing. They'd really just overlay each other. So what happened was that these European goods, once they made contact with this system, were just sort of sucked and pumped into a system that had been there for centuries. Traded along the same lines. traded almost certainly with the same people, the same fares, to the same centers. These European goods were passionately desired because they offered certain things that the Indians had never had. It's sort of a loaded term to refer to Stone Age people, but technically it's a correct term. These were, for the most part, with the exception of some metalwork like copper, American Indians, native peoples at the coming of Europeans, were pre-metallurgical. When I say Stone Age, think of those beautiful fluted Folsom points. Think of those extraordinary creations that they made out of flint and out of obsidian. Now so these are, while they are pre-metallurgical Stone Age people in that sense, of course, they had a very sophisticated cultures, extraordinary artistic abilities. And yet they were people without metal. And so when the Europeans introduced metal goods in particular, they were deeply taken by them. There were cases of conquistadors moving up into areas of, for example, of northern New Mexico, making the first contact into these villages, hundreds of miles from the nearest European center. Coming into these villages, the first white people to arrive there, and finding stirrups, finding pieces of armor, pieces of mail, finding all sorts of metalwork, things that were sort of stolen from or cast aside by the Spanish, and were immediately pulled into this trading system because they were useful, because they could be used. My favorite example of this is this conquistador who comes out of the Gulf of California area, goes up into northern New Mexico, arrives in a village to find that he has been beaten there by chickens. Chickens, of course, are European imports. There were chickens walking around in this village. This could not have done anything for his ego, to see himself as a great explorer and conqueror, to find that he got there to be preceded by his own chickens. So things like that were brought into this as well. So what happens is that very quickly then, this sophisticated trading network begins to pulse with these European goods, and that, of course, in turn begins to change the lives of these people. Remember these villages of the Hidatsas and the Mandans. These are the villages where Lewis and Clark stopped on their way up the Missouri in 1804, winter of 1804 to 1805. These villages had been, if you go back to this map, up there in the Missouri, they've been a very old trading transit point with the European contact. They serve the same purpose. How many of you knew, as Lewis and Clark spending their winter in this village, how many of you knew, if you read the journals closely, you will see that there were 7 British traders living there as well? We have this impression, that they're off on the edge of civilization, that there's no other Europeans out there, no other white people out there. Europeans have been there, British and French traders have been there for generations. Thomas Jefferson gave Lewis and Clark, as they ascended the Missouri, among the things that he gave them was a Welsh glossary. A Welsh glossary. He gave them a list of words translating, from English to Welsh. Why would he do that? Anybody know? What? He believed there was this ancient myth, Prince Madoc of Wales. A swiftly tilting planet by Madeline L'Engle was based upon this old myth that Prince Madoc, centuries ago, sailed from Wales over to the New World, and his descendants could still be found in America. Jefferson believed that. Welsh businessmen believed that. One of the people who went there before Lewis and Clark was a young man sent by these wealthy Welsh businessmen to try to find Welshmen on the upper Missouri. Jefferson thought that the Mandans were Welsh. He had heard that there were these very European-looking Indians.
You obviously hadn't seen their skulls.
Clearly, right. These European-looking Indians up on the Missouri River. So he said, they got to be the Welsh. Well, the Mandans and the Hidatsas were European-looking because there had been British and French living among them, for 30 years, intermarrying with them, siring mixed-blood children. This was a Métis population. mixed bud population. That's why they look European. So, Lewis and Clark will, get off the keel boat and say hello in Welsh. These people look at them and say, "What?" And these are the goods that are found. These are some of the goods that have been found in excavations at these same villages. All sorts of metalwork. Metal points, weapons, and of course, guns. Guns, yes.
Isn't it true that when they got to the western coast, like particularly Portland, that the Indians there could speak some English, like curse words?
They could speak English and Russian.
And they had like English hats, and they've been
Oh,
trading
yes.
for like years.
All
and
sorts of
years.
trade along the Pacific coast. That was not a terribly great surprise. They sort of halfway expected that. They were surprised by the extent of the trade. The contact with Indian women among the Clatsop and others. Women had tattooed numbers in the Russian acrylic alphabet on their arm because they were designated as a particular trader with a particular contact with a particular Russian trader. They were plugged into that contact along the Pacific coast. Right.
Wasn't Sacagawea's husband a first trader?
Of course, he was a mixed bud. He was a mixed bud Métis. Toussaint Charbonneau, worthless guy, but he was part of his system as well. Sure. And he's a good example of this. There was all of these folks crawling over the northern plains along the upper Missouri who were part of this tradition. And these are the kind of goods that they were trading by the early 19th century. Now, of these goods, looking at these goods, you can see certain goods that really stood out in their minds as particularly useful. Obviously, points. Problem with a flint point is that it breaks. It breaks while you're napping it. Get down to the very end of it, and it breaks. Dang! It breaks when you use it. These metal points last much longer. Fish hooks. See the fish hooks up there? What are they used for fish hooks before? What do they make of? Bone. Bone. To get a fish hook small enough to be useful for catching trout in a river catching fish in a river like the Missouri, you've got to shave it very, very thin. It's very tedious work. It breaks very easily. Think how much more valuable that metal fish hook would be. A metal pot lasts virtually forever, as opposed to a ceramic pot. Long time to make, easily broken, just drop it and it's gone. So these things, these items, are all or making a hole in an animal skin to making clothing. This was hugely useful to an Indian woman. Alls before, like fish hooks, made out of bone, that broke very easily. It's a great book by a woman archaeologist on the eastern woodlands. And the title of the book is "What's This All About?" AWL. But it goes into her analysis is looking at this archaeological material from European contact and sort of gendering it, saying, what does this mean for a woman living in these eastern woodlands among the Dakota, the eastern Sioux? Something like that all, is a miracle. A miracle in woman's work. So this is all very, very useful stuff. Gorgets, these things up here that are medallions, that are prestige goods. But of these European items, two items in this trade had a consequence and a value well above everything else. One, as you might guess, is up here in this corner, guns. Guns, which are very useful for all sorts of things, between killing people, besides killing people. They are also prestige goods. Can you imagine the sort of how impressive the first firearm would be to someone who's never seen one before? They are more useful for hunting and for warfare in some areas than others. And one of the things about guns is they were especially useful on the plains. Because of the geography, the openness of it. A rifle in the woodlands has certain limitations. You got to get very close to an animal because it's hidden in the woods, in the brush. If you're fighting in the woodlands, it's easier to protect yourself from firearms, again, because of the woods. The openness of the plains made guns, made firearms far more valuable. So these are especially useful on the plains. They're essentially sort of imported energy. Think of gunpowder as sort of imported energy coming in from the outside that can be applied. That can be applied to this to your world. The other item, which is also of special use on the plains, but even more revolutionary in its impact on the plains, was the horse. The horse. And the horse is the key, really, even more than guns, to this revolution that happens. Horses. Now, the one really fascinating irony to this is that horses, when they were brought onto the plains by Europeans for the first time, were really coming home, returning home, because horses had begun on the plains. Horses originally evolved on the Great Plains. This is the earliest kind of horse that we know of, Hyracotherium. Used to be called Eohippus. Translates roughly as sort of rabbit horse, about the size of a large jackrabbit. First evolved in the plains, probably 50 to 60 million years ago. Shoot. I thought I had a slide on there that shows sort of the family tree of the horse, from Hyracotherium eohippus up to the modern form, Equus caballo, the horse that we know. If you can imagine, it's sort of a typical evolutionary roadmap. Evolution, of course, doesn't happen in this straight line. It's more like a bush with all sorts of branches going out here and dying off and being pruned off. And then if you follow it up through, you can see how it evolves finally up into this modern form that was there by the time of the Pleistocene. So by the time of this last ice age, the horse that we would recognize was on the plains, and as you can also expect, it was there in extraordinary numbers, just as there was this huge population of these other grazers, like the different kinds of bison and early antelopes and camels, those other kinds of animals living upon those grasses, because this was an extraordinarily rich pasture land. In fact, it was part of one great pasture land. Think of it this way. Imagine, get in your head a view of the world, a globe, as we normally see it. We're, of course, in the immediate center, always. That's the way the globe naturally looks, right? With the United States right in the center. So you're looking at it. You're also looking at the equator. Now take this globe and tilt it toward you. So now in the center, there's the North Pole, right? So you're looking from the North Pole down. It's called, not surprisingly, the circumpolar world. You're looking at sort of the northern hemisphere. If you look at it that way, when the glaciers were not there, there was, or think of it this way, with Beringia, with the land bridge, there was, with the exception of the glaciers, one continuous pasture that went from what's today Texas and parts of northern Mexico all the way to Western Europe, up through all of the Great Plains. Then there's the ice pack. Then there's Beringia, which was this 300 or 400 mile wide pasture, into Siberia, which is all grassland, all the way over to the edge of Europe, down south to China. A huge percentage of the land mass of the world was in this great pasture. That explains why there's this two-way traffic across Beringia. The bison, which evolved here, move over to Europe, all the way to Europe. The horse, which evolves here, goes over to Siberia. Camels evolve here. They go over there. The cats evolve here and chase the camels over there. At the same time, there are other animals over there coming here, including human beings. All of them part of this movement back and forth. It's all based upon grasses. Grasses that support the animals, support the people that are hunting the animals. Right? So the horses evolve in the Great Plains as the ice sheets begin to break up, and perhaps before they were there. The horses make this transition over into Siberia. They became extinct over here during the Great Die-Off, but they flourished over there because that remains this great habitat for horses. Central Asia becomes the heartland of this horse population. And in Central Asia, probably about 5,000 years ago, for the first time, people domesticated horses. First learned to ride them. In Central Asia, that the first horse cultures developed. I'll go into that term in just a minute. And Central Asia, of course, remains today essentially a horse culture. If you know much about that part of the world, they'll still rely on horses. Still, the horse is still sort of central to their way of life. They become, as every horse culture I can think of would become, a more militaristic people, because horses give such an enormous advantage in warfare. So they become eventually, of course, the Mongols. Sweep all the way down into southern Europe, down into China. But everywhere a horse culture conquers, those people eventually take it up themselves. And so through a process of probably a combination of trade and conquest, these horse cultures begin to spread outward from central Siberia, Central Asia, down into China, down into Southern Asia, to the Middle East, over into North Africa, where they, of course, become one of the great horse cultures of the Arabs, and then finally up into Europe. Europe is one of the last places in the old world to acquire horses, but once they acquire them, the same thing happens that happens every place else. The horse becomes central to their way of life because they're so useful for all sorts of things. All sorts of power. All sorts of power. It revolutionizes the social system of Europe, or helps revolutionize it, as well as the economic system. The development of feudalism. Who were the lords? When a prince would choose those to be his supporters, who did he choose? People with horses. People with horses. What is the Spanish word for gentleman? Caballero. Caballero. What does it translate literally as? Horseman. Horseman. A gentleman was a horseman. Somebody with a horse. He had the power. Horses become the sort of the key to military conquest and to military control. Everybody's seen Braveheart, right? Everybody's seen Braveheart. That scene in Braveheart, where the English cavalry's bearing down on them, and they figure out the way to pick up the pikes and impale the horses. But that's one way to fight people on horseback. But what you really get a sense of in that movie is what that must have felt like, with these things bearing down on you, the noise of it, the vibration on the ground of these incredibly powerful animals just bearing straight down on you. It's absolutely terrifying. So horses equaled power, and they revolutionized society wherever they were. The Europeans were among the last of the old world peoples to acquire them, who would acquire them. And in the Iberian Peninsula of Europe, there developed probably the finest horse culture of all the Europeans, because it was a blend of European and North African, of Moorish influences. So the Spanish were the ones who had sort of taken the use of the horse, the possibilities of the horse, and developed it to the highest degree. And it was the Spanish, of course, who were the ones who ended up making the jump across the Atlantic. The Spanish, who relied heavily upon the horses, to conquer the Indies and Mexico and South America. And it was the Spanish who then, in the person of this man, brought the horse for the first time back up onto the plains. So when Coronado came up in the 1540s, guided by the Turk, up into southern Kansas, to the Arkansas River, and brought his men up there, proceeded to strangle the Turk and go home. Without knowing it, without realizing what he was doing, he was bringing the horse home. When the horses first appeared there on the plains there, they had circumnavigated the world. They had come all the way around and had come back now in the middle of the 16th century. But they came back, and this is the key point. They came back really, in effect, as a new species. Not literally, of course. This was the same Equus caballo that had been here before. But they came back as the result of 5,000 years of partnership between horses and people. 5,000 years of interrelationship. And I mean that literally. We always think, of course, of people who adopt the horses as becoming dependent upon horses, and they are. But there's all sorts of ways in which horses become dependent on people. This had become a mutual relationship, a symbiotic relationship. And the two had grown to know each other very, very well over that time. So in effect, what came back here was literally, think of it this way, this is literally a caballero. Think of a man on horseback as literally a horseman. Think of it as one animal. One animal. Centaur. Think centaur. Because what is this? What is the horse? What is it but this animal of extraordinary power, and speed, grace, and beauty, married to, with a human brain and human imagination. It's the human spirit using this new power to achieve things it could not do before. Scott Momaday, who wrote Way to Rainy Mountain that you read, has another book in which he talks about this. His people, the Kiowas, when they came down, acquired the horse as they moved down to the Great Plains. And he said, we became centaurs of the spirit. Centaurs of the spirit. Is that a great phrase? They came to think of themselves, as a kind of a new being. And they were, and that's the point. This was, in a sense, a new animal. A new thing, and as it had been every time that had happened before, going back 5,000 years. It became this illustration by George Catlin. Think of this spiritually. I had been on a horse in decades, but I do remember as a boy, being on a horse as it galloped. There was nothing like feeling that. That feeling of power, feeling of speed, feeling of something living under you, being part of something that powerful, carrying you, being part of one thing. What happens when that spreads to a culture? They just rethink themselves. They become different people. You see this when you read these accounts of these accounts of European traders making contact with these plains horse people relatively soon after they have acquired the horse. One that I remember, this English trader approaches this village, and coming out to meet him is a man on a white horse like that. The horse is painted gaudily in red, with a sort of a head that's made to look like an antelope, And there's all sorts of ribbons and beads in the mane of the horse. The man is nude, and he comes out and sings a song to the trader, and then dismounts and puts the trader back on the horse and leads the horse back into the village. Something's going on there. Something's going on there. He's it's an expression of power and arrogance, even an expression of we're somebody to deal with. We're inviting you in to consider doing something with you. Consider letting you into this world. Confidence, a sense of confidence and power, of renewal, of revolution, of new life that came out of this. What's it really mean? What's really going on here? It has to do with this. With grass. It's all about grass. Because what has really happened here? What has happened here? It has to do with this. Anybody know what the energy pyramid is? Maybe also teach biology along with history. Energy pyramid refers to a sort of a fundamental rule in the chains of life. In the chains of life. It works like this. Basically, with some small exceptions, basically all energy in our world comes from the sun. The sun pours down this unimaginable amount of energy onto our world. And our world absorbs it and turns it into forms that living species, organic matter, can use. Now, one of the things it turns into is plants, including grasses. And plains grasses are very efficient converters of solar energy and storages of solar energy. Now think tomorrow when we go out on the plains, it may be cloudy as it was this morning, but think of how much energy is being poured down on the plains at any given second. Think of sort of solar, term like solar hours. There's no such term that I know of, but all of it is energy, and it's all pouring down, bearing down on the plains, and part of it is being converted into this grass. So what this really is this, it looks like nothing, or next to nothing, but what this really is this huge storage battery. Look at that, and we see it as inert, as nothing's happening. But think of it as sort of pulsing and thrumming with energy, because it is, waiting to be used. Waiting to be used. But the problem with that for us is that we can't get at it. We can get down on all fours and eat it, but it's not going to do much good. Because our metabolism, our bodies don't let us use it. We're omnivores, we can eat plants, but we can only process certain kinds of plants. And this is not one of them. So this energy is removed from us. We cannot directly get at it. Instead, we have to wait for something else to use it and get it in. Bison, pronghorns, cattle, they all can use it. So they eat it, they turn it into their own form of energy, meat. We take the meat. We can use meat. So we're one step removed. The problem is this. The energy pyramid is a basic rule. Every time that a form of energy is taken by something else for itself, it loses 90% of it. It can only take advantage of 10% of the energy that's there. So if X is the energy of the sun being poured down on the plains, when grass takes it, grass can only take in about 10% of it. But still, there's so much to begin with. There's this huge store of energy out there. So a bison eats the grass, but by now, once the bison eats the grass, the bison is down to 1% of the solar energy. because it loses 90% when it takes it. When we eat the bison, we're down to 0.1%. So, when those Indians went out there and killed those bison for their own consumption and for trade, to get the meat, to get the protein, what they're really eating is sunlight, but they only have access to 1/1000th of the original amount. Right? You're a grizzly, you're really out of luck. Grizzly eats a person, he's down to a 10,000th of X. So that's the reason that there's so much more grass than bison, so many more bison than wolves or people, and so many more people than grizzlies. It's this fascinating sort of paradox, because we think of people and grizzlies at the top of the food chain, and they are. But the thing is, being at the top of the food chain means you're at the top of the energy pyramid, which means you have access only to this very small amount of the energy itself. So while you appear to be the kingpin, you're really the loser. You really have lost access, to so much of the energy below you. Everybody get this? Okay.
Trying to figure out 2% milk, is that like 2?
It's very confusing. There's subtleties of the system. Right? So what's this mean? What then happened when somebody got on a horse? When a horse became a horseman. Hombre became a caballero. What happens when you think of this as one animal, right? X is the energy of the sun. People eating bison that eat the grass get 1,000th of the sun. The man horse chasing bison that eat the grass use 1/100th. In effect, what people did when they got on a horse is they acquired 10 times as much energy as they had before. Because if you think of a horseman as one animal, then you have this human being eating grass, a human brain, a human culture, human imagination, human desire, eating grass, tapping directly into that energy source. People were able to breach that barrier that had kept them away from the energy of the grass by getting on a horse. Right? Everybody get the point? That was the grass revolution. That was the revolution that produced the first horse culture 5,000 years ago in Central Asia. That was the revolution that changed the world wherever it came. That was the revolution that the Spaniards took advantage of in conquering, helping them conquer the Americas. And that was the revolution that the Indians themselves eventually tapped into, because they followed the pattern of everybody else. When they looked at what the Europeans were bringing, they said, "Wow, that's that pot, that's nice, right? That awl, that gun, that's really nice. But that horse, whoa, that is super nice. I want that horse. I want that horse." It's an amazing story told by a man named David Thompson, who was a British trader hired by the Hudson's Bay Company originally, who was a young man, teenager, went out and began living with the Blackfeet people of the Northern Plains. And he told the story of this Blackfeet elder, who in turn told the story of the first time that the Blackfeet saw horses. They had heard about the strange animal that was in the mountains among the Shoshones. So several of them went there. They had guns. So they took this, they had some guns, they went into the mountains to look for this strange critter. Sure enough, they saw one. So this man on a horse. They said, wow, look at that. So they got the gun, they went to shoot the man so they could get the horse. So they aimed at him, fired, the man moved, killed the horse. Oops, so the guy ran off. So they go up to this dead horse, and they looked at it, and they sort of walked around it, and sort of kicked it. And finally one of them said, it's like an elk, but like a dog, it's a slave. It's like an elk, but like a dog, it's a slave. You know, genius. He saw it instantly. What did he mean by that? Like a dog, it's a slave. What's that mean?
Serves man.
It serves man, right. It's domesticated, right? They had dogs. But it's like an elk. How is it like an elk?
Powerful, strong.
It's what? Powerful, big. What else?
Travel great distances.
Can travel great distances. What's the key? It eats grass. It eats grass. Whoa. He saw it instantly. It's a big, powerful, long-distance, grass-eating animal that we can domesticate. And that's what they did. That's what they did. But they didn't do it immediately. Another fascinating fact is that Indians, while they first saw horses, that's right, when they observed horses in the 1540s, they did not begin to acquire horses until 140 years later, after 1680. Anybody know why? Anybody know the date 1680? History of the Southwest? Pueblo Revolt, thank you. Very good. In 1680, the Pueblo peoples of the northern Rio Grande Valley rose up, drove the Spanish out of northern New Mexico for 12 years, 1680 to 1692 until the Reconquista. Northern Mexico was free of Spanish. So what? Well, the so what is the Spanish, of course, understood that the last thing they wanted to do was to allow Indians to get horses. You do not want that to happen. Horses are power, military power, they're communication. So it was essentially a capital offense for anyone to trade or to sell or to give a horse to an Indian. And so while there was some minor leakage, essentially the Spanish were able to keep horses out of the United States, out of the western United States, until the Pueblos rose up and drove them out, and suddenly the lid was off. And they began to trade horses. They began to be raided by others, including Comanches, who stole horses, and the horses began to spread very rapidly out of the northern New Mexico area, out of northern Rio Grande, first up through the Rocky Mountains into the Pacific Northwest, where Indians like the Nez Perce become some of the great horsemen of North America, and then fairly late onto the plains, probably out of the northern Rockies, and then gradually moving throughout the plains. So the dispersion of the horses comes after 1680. If you read early texts, you'll see that it started with Coronado, but that's not true. He didn't bring enough. Finally, somebody got around to looking and seeing that all of the horses that Coronado took out on the plains were stallions. So, you don't have to be a biology major to figure out that you can steal all the stallions you want, but it's, beyond one generation, you're not going to have any more. Yes?
How long is a horse's gestation period?
What is a horse gestation? You might know? It's about the same. It's about the same as a human, I believe. Yeah, about 9 or 10 months. Yeah. And typically, of course, they produce one, so it's not as rapidly producing as some animals. But, and this is the key. That's a great question. I think what's implied in that question is how fast do they reproduce? What's key here is that they were coming home to what remained one of the perfect, closest to perfect habitats that you can imagine for horses. What are called sedge grasses, especially the higher plains, where you have grasses that are nutritious all year long. You have a habitat that's beautifully suited for them. Now, it's far better on the southern plains. That's where the grape populations develop. Because of the winters of the northern plains, there was a continual sort of flow of horses from south to north in this trade once the numbers really began to grow up. Indians like the Blackfeet, Assiniboine, Crees, Crows on the northern plains had to rely on the Comanches to the south for a replenishment of horses because of the very harsh winters up there. You had a question?
Actually, I think you were just about to get to it.
Okay, if I can remember where I was. Okay, this spread takes place after 1680. Anthropologists typically use the date 1780. Now, hold on to that date. 1780 as when horse cultures were more or less in place across the far west. So 100 years. Think of that. 100 years, these people had retooled their entire cultures, their way of life, to adapt to this new innovation. It's one of the most extraordinary cases that I know of cultural adjustment. Of people seeing certain possibilities and exploiting them and pushing them, developing them with such brilliance. We, in our east to west perspective, place such emphasis on the adaptability and the imagination of European and European American pioneers as they faced the forests and the Great Plains, building sod houses, log cabins, Kentucky rifles, and they're all impressive. They're all interesting and important and impressive things. Is there anything in by that I'm meaning European American, is there anything in my cultural history that comes close, remotely close, to matching that kind of adaptation? Yes?
The cars.
The car. You've got to get into the 20th century. That's a great example.
Industrial revolution more broadly. I would say industrial
100 years.
Yes, I agree. I agree. And of course, they're along the same lines. Think of a horse as technology. It's a kind of technology. But the point is, first of all, I was also, of course, asking about pioneers, the log cabin types. I can't see any parallel there. But your point, that's an excellent point. Jill, right? The Jill is making, because the suggestion here, it's on par with that. This is a revolution like the Industrial Revolution, like the automobile revolution. To me, it's equally impressive and equally consequential, what it means to these people. What can a horse do? What's some of the obvious advantages of a horse?
Mobility.
Mobility. And both in speed and in distance. You can go a lot farther. You can go a lot faster when you need to.
And strength.
Strength.
Work capability.
Working ability, whether it's, now these weren't farmers, so they weren't pulling a plow, but it had strength has all sorts of purposes. Pulling things, killing things, that is
Catching the
bearing
bison.
down, warfare, obviously.
Catching up to the bison.
Catching up to the bison. They become masters at hunting bison by horseback. Not with guns, incidentally. It was far more efficient to use short bows. So they adapt this old technology using metal points, shorter bows, which are more, shorter bows are more usable on a horseback. They have less power than a long bow, but you need less power because now you can get close to whatever you're going to kill. And they do it with amazing ability. They can fire arrows from horseback so rapidly that they can fire up to, these Indians could fire up to 5 arrows at 5 arrows with one being in the air at all times. You would have one launched from a bow before the other one hit. Okay, so there's this, revolution, literally this revolution in the way that these people are living, but that is based on this other revolution, the revolution in the relationship to their environment. That's my point. What this revolutionized was the humans' relationship to their physical setting. They were able to break through this barrier that they had not before. And that unleashed everything else. And creates this blossoming of power and affluence and confidence. Look what it does. Here, remember, this is a scene of the Querechos, the people that Coronado saw. You look at it and say, well, it's a typical Plains Indian scene, but look closer. The woman's sitting down. If she were to stand up, she would be almost as tall as that lodge. These were small, like pup tents. Bison head. The dog over there, see the dog with a travois? The dog was the only domesticated animal they had. It's pulling a travois. That's the two poles lashed together. The dog was their beast of burden. You can see some bison meat drying over there. See the question before about how do they preserve this meat. There's some bison meat drying back there. So this is pre-horse. What are the differences?
Huge tent.
What's that? Huge tents. Big tents. Why would you need big tents?
Keep up with the Joneses.
Keep up with the Joneses? What else?
Big families?
Bigger families, population grows.
Put all your stuff in them.
Put all your stuff in a trade. You got what's the old George Carlin routine? A place for your stuff. You a bigger garage, right? Bigger house, because you've got a lot more things. This is affluence. Bigger house, more stuff.
Plus, they use the horse to pull their tent.
Now you have a horse that can pull something that big. So the horse is now the dog,
Replace the
the
dog.
slave, pulling its more partner. They're chasing bison out there. Lots of bison meat now. Bison robe, making for trade. This represents this burst of this sort of flowering of culture,
Prosperity.
great boom. All right. There's a downside. In the long term, one of the downsides you read about, and we'll talk about later, but there's another one. Goods are not the only things that are sucked into this trading system that develops here. There are other things as well. I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with the fact that one of the reasons that Europeans were able to conquer the New World as rapidly as they did was because they introduced diseases that New World peoples had not had contact with before. And therefore, they had very little resistance to these diseases. And these diseases decimated these populations, and I mean that literally in some cases, down by 90% over a period of relatively short period of time. Now, the reasons that they were so susceptible, as I said, because they had not had any contact with them before. The reason for that is kind of interesting and ties in all to the rest of us. From what we can tell now, most of these what are called crowd diseases or contact diseases, that is, diseases that are passed directly from one person to another person. Most crowd diseases are very young in the human story. Most of them go back only about 5,000 to 6,000 years. During that 5,000 to 6,000 years span, old world peoples gradually developed some resistance to these diseases. The diseases that are around the longest, they develop the greatest resistance to. Well, these are often diseases that we call childhood diseases because you get them as a child. They're viruses. If you survive them, and you almost certainly do, you'll never get them again. Measles, one of these. Many other examples. Chickenpox is another. Other diseases are tougher to deal with, and so we've developed vaccines and so forth to cope with them. But in all cases, these diseases were exclusively Old World. So why didn't they develop in the New World? And why did they develop in the Old World only so recently? Anybody want to guess? The best guess that we have? Yes. And not strictly, not the horse per se, pardon?
Domesticated animals.
Domesticated animals.
Guns, germs, and steel.
Thank you. Jared's read Jared Diamond. The answer is,
Great book.
it is a great book. What this does is coincide with the mass domestication of animals. All of these crowd diseases were examples of diseases that originate in animals, but jump to people and mutate into a human-to-human form once people and animals begin living together very closely. Most of them come from pigs, chickens, cattle. Not many from horses. So when people, and remember, what we're talking about domesticated animals, we're talking about the chaos, right? Literally living for weeks at a time, closed in one building with these animals. It's the perfect breeding ground. And of course, we have a great illustration of that right now. What are we terrified of in this world? Bird flu, influenza, a new type of which emerges every year, almost invariably jumps from birds to people, starts with birds to people, sometimes pigs to people, sometimes birds to pigs to people. But that's always the connection. And that's how all of these diseases probably start, including the common cold, that virus. But give it 5,000 years, and a population sort of gets used to it. What you do is lose all of those, that part of the gene pool that is especially susceptible to those diseases, they're gone. They don't have babies. The ones who have babies are the ones who have that genetic disposition to resist. And so after a while, the entire population becomes more resistant. And it's that population then that becomes a carrier, takes those diseases over to the New World, except unlike in the first scenario, they don't come one at a time over a period of with centuries in between. This happens, wham, literally at once, I mean, within 2 generations. They come in, and they have these mass epidemics of many diseases that lead to this collapse of populations that you see in Mexico, and especially those densely populated areas. But it doesn't happen everywhere at once. It happens immediately in the West Indies, in Mexico, in those places where the contact is direct between the Spanish and the native populations, and where the populations are very dense and close together, right? But when, and the worst of these diseases, and it's a terrible disease for Europeans as well as Indians, but worse for Indians, was this one. What is that? Smallpox. Smallpox. This is arguably the greatest killer in human history, this virus. It exists officially in only 2 places in the world today. Atlanta, Georgia, Boulder, Colorado. So don't get, no, not Boulder. It's no, Russia. That's right. No, it's in CDC, and it's in the equivalent of CDC in the old Soviet Union. There's always there's a debate this year again about whether to kill it. But it's sort of locked up in this super secret, super secure vault. It's like sort of Hannibal Lecter of the virus world. You ain't going to give it a chance to get out. And there's always argument of whether we should go ahead and kill it. It's the only disease that has been purposely eradicated from the human population. The only disease ever, which gives you some idea of just how dangerous it is. It's absolutely terrifying, as well as its obvious effects. Now, what I'm going to show you next, briefly, is a slide of a man with full-blown smallpox. I am not a squeamish person. But I cannot look at this slide for more than 5 seconds or so. So if you don't want to look at it, don't look at it. But it will. This is. Okay. Okay. What it does, it begins with a aching in the joints, flu-like symptoms, raging headaches, very high fever, and then erupts in boils, blisters. The type of smallpox is characterized by how close together those blisters are. If they are far apart, then you'll probably survive. You'll be scarred, but you will probably survive. If they are close together, as they were with this man, he's dead. He cannot survive. What happens if you don't die from the fever? What happens is those blisters burst, and when the blisters burst, you have no skin. You've in effect been flayed. Your skin has been taken off, and of course your skin protects you from everything else. Okay, so but smallpox, when does it first appear in the West? The Southwest, fairly early, those places where the Spanish are. But it never goes anywhere. It stays there. It's confined in Santa Fe, confined in San Antonio, confined in Taos, confined at Tucson, San Javier. It stays there. Suddenly, it's all across the West. When does that happen? This is a winter count. You all familiar with winter counts? These are ways in which Native people sort of record their history. Each one of those symbols represents a particular year. You know, the most important thing that happened in that year. So it's the year of this or the year of that. Where Mark is at Agate Springs, got a great example of a beautiful, beautiful winter count there. They're really remarkable documents. This is one, and this is one of the symbols on it. Smallpox used them up winter. It stands for, here's this man who's covered with boils. The symbol up there means great pain in the body. So this is a year that smallpox, these are Western Sioux people. This was the year that smallpox hit them. This, as far as we know, is the first smallpox epidemic on the plains and in the far west generally. Look at the year. What is that?
The year of the horse you talked about?
I asked you when I said, what year is it that the anthropologists say that the horse cultures were basically in place? 1780. Now, I'm not saying, please don't misunderstand, I'm not saying that they waited until it was exactly in place, then have the epidemic. It's a nice coincidence, but it's not exactly a coincidence. The point is that this, what's called a pandemic, that is an epidemic over a very large area, its pandemic could not occur until what? Until there were horses. Because only with horses could you make those connections fast enough to spread the epidemic. Yes?
Well, the pandemic was on the East Coast as well. Abigail Adams took her, they
Thank you.
had learned, because she took her children, very daring, I thought, she took her children and they cut them and they took pus from
Yes.
an active.
From cowpox, yes. That's the way they would inoculate. That's right. The earliest forms of, in fact, the word vaccination comes from vaca, from cow. Vaccination was you would take cowpox, which is a related form of smallpox, but one that doesn't kill you. You would lance, I'm not trying to get too gross here, to lance a sore on a cow, dip a kernel of corn in the stuff, make an incision in a person's skin, and slip that kernel of corn under the skin. It's a way of inoculation. But it works. I mean, if it's going to save your child, you know, that's what you do.
They
But
were
that's
taking such a chance because you didn't know
yep.
would they survive
Yeah.
inoculation.
Indeed, but that's an excellent point because this was a continent-wide epidemic. This great book came out a few years ago by Elizabeth Finn called Pox, P-O-X, Pox Americana. And it's about the smallpox epidemic that lasted from about 1776, 77, all the way up into the early 1780s. It starts shoot. Well, I thought I had a map of it here. It starts on the East Coast. It has a very important impact on the American Revolution. It's one of these things that her book showed. How the smallpox epidemic affected the military history of the Revolutionary War in ways that we really hadn't accounted for, taken into account. It spread from there down into Mexico, to the Gulf Coast, and then elsewhere. Now look at this. Think back to that old trading network map I showed you, right? This was an important part of it. It's the old Shoshone-Comanche trade. It's part of that larger system. The next map shows you the route that the smallpox moved. I think it's an exact parallel. What happened was that the smallpox was moving along that trade route in the same way that all of those other goods had. Well, the question is, why didn't it do it before? When there was smallpox down here before. Only in 1779 and 80 did it make that jump. Why then? Because now they had horses. Before horses, a person gets smallpox. There's a 10-day window in which that person has no symptoms.
Is that when
Then-
they're contagious though?
No, it's not contagious until you begin to break out. So then you've got, to get back to your question, how fast did you die? There's about a week in there when you can pass that contagion on. But if everybody's on foot, or only a few horses, you will not reach another virgin population before the person either dies or becomes immune. So the distance insulated all of this area. With a horse, suddenly that's no longer a protection. With a horse, they're then able to get up, to move from place to place, and of course, think of what your response would be once this happens. Once it begins to settle in on you that you can't stop this, you get the hell out. Except you're now sort of a missile. You're now a carrier. So you get to this other group, and it breaks out, same thing happens. This spreads, explodes across the West. This is from Elizabeth Finn's book, Estimates of Deaths up there in the Revolutionary War area. Now look down here. Here are the people of the Willows. 13,000 dead. Northern Plains, 10,400. Northwest Coast, 25,000 dead on the Northwest Coast. So, with that, what you begin to see is the other side of the grass revolution. What all of this is doing is increasing these people's power. But the way that happens is they are also tied much more closely and tightly into the larger world. That gives them great things. Gives them all sorts of stuff that end up in the teepees, right? All of those trade goods. That's good. But it also brings them something that they didn't count on. Yes?
It's also impacted blacks.
Yes,
for example.
it's interesting here is that these black loyalists, blacks were some of the, there was large inoculation among whites, but they often would not inoculate blacks. Yes?
What kind of percentages, when we're looking at those numbers of deaths in the Great Plains, amongst Great Plains people, what kind of percentage of their population are we?
It's really difficult to say. And I should say, while she's a very careful historian, this is a brilliant book, that these numbers are always debatable. And there were many people who say that this is probably too high. And it's, of course, as you can imagine, why. It's really difficult, to be precise about this at all. But we know from other areas where we can be quite clear what the impact could be. Iceland did not experience smallpox until well into the middle of the 18th century, not long before this. Population of Iceland was about 56,000. Within 6 months, 17,000 died. The population of the Mandans in a later epidemic, 1834, the population, when it was introduced, by that time it dropped to somewhere around 600 persons. In September, when it hit, in April the population was 50. Now a lot of those had dispersed. But what happens is populations simply collapse. When Lewis and Clark, this is of course 1780, Lewis and Clark come through in 1805, 1806. They moved north out of the Mandan villages in the spring, and they come across what they said was this ancient habitation. What we know now is a place called Double Ditch. It was this very large village of Hidatsas that was simply abandoned in 1780 because of this. It was only 25 years old. 25 years since they had left it. So what often happened was these villages would coalesce. You know, you would have 5 villages combined into one. But it was, of course, absolutely devastating. And what brought it? What brought it was the same thing that brought these people this revolutionized life. So this was the other American Revolution that was going on. Interestingly, sort of climaxes about the same time, and at least it's another, I think, argument for continually shifting, broadening our focus of American history. In this case, to include the center of the country, where something equally important, I think, is going on, the history of the continent, as we see on the Atlantic coast. Okay, thanks very much. Let's get some lunch.